Can you, for instance, trace for us the historical roots of where the judges then begin to assume powers that should ordinarily be with the electorate?
What I do in the book is quite deliberate, which is simply unfold the narrative and let people reach their conclusions. And I deliberately step away from providing conclusions. And that's very deliberate. But really, the book pursues two related narratives. One is the evolution of the institutional notions of institutional independence or lack of it in the Nigerian judiciary. The other is the evolution of this problem of judicial immersion in election dispute resolution. And now, judicial immersion in election dispute resolution is at two levels. There is the retail dimension, which is disputations over constituency elections. For the most part, that's been with us since at least 1959. However, because the constituencies are delimited and discrete, it never really rose to the level of a major problem. And there were 20 years between the 1959 general elections and the 1979 general elections. And what was new in 1979 was that we had one single constituency election for all of the country. That was introduced by presidentialism. So in the presidential election, the presidency is a national constituency election. And dispute resolution for that purpose is therefore to scale, which was new to the country. Now, that is where the problem of electoral dysfunction started, which had consequences for the judiciary. But the story about judicial independence and its dysfunction started earlier. And it started effectively with the decentralization of the judiciary in 1954, following the London-Lagos Constitutional Conferences. And when you read the book, you will find out that caused so much problem that the Chief Justice at the point, John Verity, resigned. And because he was against the decentralization of the judiciary, fearing that was going to precisely politicize the judiciary and defang it in exactly the way it did, actually.
Yeah.
And he was right. But the issue of the relationship of judiciary to elections probably goes back to 1958, the succession to John Foster Sutton, who was the last colonial era expatriate Chief Justice of Nigeria, the succession that brought Adetokunbo Ademola to office as Chief Justice. Because in that, the politics was such that people did not want Olumuyiwa Ibowu to be Chief Justice, and he was eliminated in a story those who read the book will probably discover. And Adetokunbo Ademola, who was seen as a more emollient character, was then installed as Chief Justice. Now, some things then happened in the immediate aftermath of independence. The crisis in the Western region ended up in the case of Adegbenro Akintola, which was the case in which the action group, at the time, there was a young man, relatively then, who was a presidential assistant. He was actually SA Domestic Matters to the President. His name was Andy Oba. He was much more influential than his official designation suggested. Andy, after INEC had announced the results declaring Nicholas Ukachukwu as winner, Andy procured INEC in Abuja to set aside that result administratively. Mind you, at that point, the only person who could do that or entity was the Election Petition Tribunal. Andy procured INEC to set aside that result and announced his elder brother Ugochukwu Uba as the winner. The problem was that Ugochukwu Uba was not a candidate in the election. He was not on the ballot. He had never contested for the office. So INEC in Abuja announced as the winner of the election a man who was not on the ballot and whom the people had never had the opportunity to consider. As an open and short case, this was easy. Nicholas Ukachukwu went to court, and the first instance tribunal upheld his case. From there, they went on appeal. And at the appeal appellate panel comprised 3 justices of the Court of Appeal. Opene presiding, Akas, and Adeniji as associate justices. Andy Uba, I'm saying this because this was actually affirmed and validated by high-level judicial inquiry by the NJC, so I'm not saying anything that is defamatory, and it's in the book. Andy Uba and his brothers, that is Ugochukwu Uba, and the younger brother, Chris Uba, from UPN and installed Akin Omobori Owo as winner. What changed? In Ondo State, The Yoruba people of Ondo State decided the state will burn if the theft was sustained. In Anambra State, the Igbo people of old Anambra decided this matter is for the politicians. Everybody collected their oba and ended up in the market. There was peace in Anambra State, and Ondo State was burning. The issues were absolutely the same, and the judgment came down on the same day. In Ondo State, the Supreme Court decided, no, we will not supply petrol to these matches. And so what did they do? By a vote of 6-1, they overturned the election declared in Ondo State, returned the mandate to UPN. By a vote of 6-1, they sustained the election in Anambra State and returned Christian Ono as winner. The will of the people of Ondo frightened the Supreme Court 83. Anambra State people did not have any will to frighten the Supreme Court. The will of the people in these cases can cascade into consequences. That is the outcome of what happened. That's the lesson I draw from that.
Do we live in a different world? In 83, the people, the circumstances, etc. in 83 seem to be, I'm not making excuses, I'm just exploring, seem to be radically different from what we have today in 2025. People are much poorer today. People are so jaded today that I remember when we were back in school, university activism, etc., you felt like if you were protesting against military rule, even if you got shot, even if you died or whatever, society would change. But today, there's a sense that you fight, you lose your life, you get injured. The people who are feeding on the system keep feeding on the system. So the examples you've given seem to me to be from a completely different era, and that the challenges we face today cannot be solved with that same level of thinking. What is wrong with my understanding of this situation?
Well, I'll give you another example from 2023, much more recent. In 2023, the president of the Court of Appeal, who comes from Plateau State, sent a judicial hit squad to Plateau State and robbed the PDP of all the seats they won and handed them to the APC. Yes? Except one seat, the governorship. After they had robbed the PDP of all the parliamentary seats, there were governorship elections petitions waiting to be decided at the Supreme Court. The three coincided. Three major governorship petitions came to decision at the same time. One was Plateau, the other was Zamfara, and the other was Kano. Yes? What linked all of these? These were three centerpieces of violence in Nigeria. Kano, in Kano, everybody was getting their petrol cans ready. In Plateau, mass killings were ongoing. In Zamfara, people were getting their den guns ready. And Supreme Court looked at Kano in particular and decided it was too far. Because if the Supreme Court had handed that to APC, as some people were minded to tell them to do, there would be heavens will not fall, as somebody said. Kano would have been burned beyond recognition. In Plateau State, things were going to happen if they took the governorship and handed it to APC. And there are times when even judges, judiciaries that are bandit, will not allow themselves to go beyond particular points. And part of this problem is, by the way, if your life is so desperate as what you've imagined or what you've described, what else do you have to lose? What else do you have to lose? So at some point as citizens, we've got to say enough is enough. And you see now, you're going back to what we discussed, what I call the genitalization and filialization of the judiciary. Because, fact now that people are appointing those whom they sleep with. That is people with whom they have genital contact, right? That's genitalization. And people who are from their families, that's filialization. So, you see, with that, you're not even, now, first of all, and this is a point I make in the book. First of all, elections are supposed to be decided in the polling units.
Yeah.
Now, we move them from polling units to the bedroom, where husband and wife, Alabu Kachua, can decide what happens. But it's no longer enough. Now we move them from polling units to courts.
Courtrooms.
Courtrooms. And from courtroom to bedrooms, right? When you have moved elections to bedrooms where husband and wife decide who wins and loses, you know you are in a serious difficulty. At that point, something has got to give. And that at the minimum, we've got to say that should no longer be the case. We don't need to amend any constitution for that part.